and we will get going because it's 1:30. If you have questions, don't be shy. We are going to get through specific scenarios at the end of class, but put them in the chat. I see Angela's here and Jason's here, and I'm sure others. So that everyone's watching the chat and we'll speak up and answer questions. We'll get going. Okay, so what we're going to do today is go over the new representation forms and how to kind of submit offers and the paperwork required to make sure you get compensated properly. And we all heard a very fun and exciting announcement that they made some changes to some of the forms that were effective last Friday. And we'll go through what those changes are. There's nothing earth shattering. They just kind of cleaned up a little bit of things, but definitely happy you're here for the second time, or if not, just for the first time to kind of understand what we're working with these days. So here's what we're going to do in this class. First, we're going to talk real quickly about like, why are we even having to do this in the first place? Talk about how to fill out the new listing and buyer rep forms, or the changes. And then we're going to talk about best practices for writing offers and documenting compensation with the new forms that we have and what those forms look like. And then also just different compensation scenarios and how to handle those. So we will take it away. I'm going to move the chat over where I can see it better. Perfect. Okay. So let's get going. So why are we here? This is a great place to start. Jason suggested this, our new manager in the North, and I think it's really smart. The reason that we are having these discussions in the first place is, there were several class action lawsuits that kind of alleged consumer confusion, collusion, unfairness, all of these things. So as a result, NAR settled those lawsuits and agreed that we would change our practices in certain ways. One of the big ways that they said we would change our practices is that we would no longer offer buyers of agent, we would no longer disclose if a seller is offering buyer agent compensation through our MLS. Now it's up to the agents to communicate that directly to other brokers and consumers. And you can see our contract, this is page 5 of the contract. And it basically says, regarding brokers' fees, all obligations for payment of brokers' fees are contained in separate written agreements. That's not new, that was there before. In the past, the separate written agreement we had was that we posted in the MLS, BAC is X%, and that was a unilateral binding offer of compensation. So if you put it in the MLS, that's what we said we would pay the buyer's agent, and we didn't have to do anything otherwise to document it. We had that little spot at the end of the contract, we wrote it in, but that didn't change what was actually offered in the MLS. So now that that's gone away, we have had to, we've had to come up with some other forms that we can actually document what we're getting paid here, because without that being posted in the MLS, we don't have any documentation. So that's why we are here going through all of these fun forms and changes, and we will get started. Does anyone have any questions before we really rock and roll? No. Okay, perfect. So listing agreement, we're not going to go over the whole thing, but we'll go over the new form and kind of how it changed. So this is the listing agreement. It's all of the terms regarding broker compensation are in paragraph 5. And basically you have 5A and you have 5B. This language here is really important. And this is some language that we also agreed to in the settlement, that we would say broker compensation is fully negotiable. Brokers independently determine their fees, et cetera, et cetera. So we have 5A and 5B. And 5A addresses the situation where the seller is offering compensation to the buyer's broker. Now, we've all sat down with sellers and we sit down and we say, we charge 3% plus a $395 administration fee as our fee, right? And then the question is, what would you like to, is there an amount you would like to offer to pay a buyer's broker? Most buyers have representation, and those brokers need to be paid. So it happens in the industry where we the sellers agree to offer an amount to pay directly to cover the buyer's broker's fees, and you agree to that up front. So in this case, the seller says, yes, I think that's a good idea. You get your fee of 3% plus $3.95, and you can see how that's filled out here in A1, A and B. And then also we'll agree to pay the buyer's broker 3%. So you put, 3% here. This is for like a flat fee amount. And then 0%, we don't allow sub-agency at Briggs Freeman, so that's always gonna be 0. And then just NA. So that covers that situation. It's pretty straightforward. Any questions? There's nothing that's hugely different in there, but one thing I want to point out, this was a change. If broker does not pay the other broker that procures a buyer as specified in 5A2, broker's fee in 5A1 will be reduced by any amount not paid to the broker. And that's a change that happened this past Friday. And what that says is, if you have a listing agreement that's at 6%, 3 and 3, and your buyer submits their paperwork and it shows that they only have 2% in their buyer's rep agreement, then in the past, the listing broker kept 4%. This language now says that the broker's fee in 5A1 is reduced by the amount not paid to the other broker. So in this case, the listing agent would still get 3, the buyer's broker would get 2, and the seller benefits from that 1%. So that was a big change that came out on Friday, is that, the delta no longer stays with the listing broker, but it goes back to the seller. That was a clarification that wasn't in the paperwork before. Questions there?
I have a question.
Yeah.
So does this mean because this is in the listing agreement, the 6%, so we're paying 3% to the buyer's broker, according to this. But if that buyer's agent has a buyer's rep agreement with their buyer, that they get paid 2%, does that apply here?
Yeah, so that applies here because, our paperwork with our seller in the listing agreement is totally separate from the buyer paperwork with their broker. So if our seller has said, yeah, I'm gonna pay you 3 and I'm gonna pay the buyer's broker 3, and the buyer's agent approaches us with an offer and they've only agreed with their buyer to get paid 2, what this paragraph right here is saying, you guys can see my cursor. This is saying, in that case, Briggs Freeman is still only gonna get 3, and the seller is gonna get the benefit of that 1% that the buyer's broker is not taking.
And so will we have a copy of that buyer's rep agreement that they have with their buyer, or, okay.
No, we won't, but we're gonna prepare a CDA, the buyer's broker will prepare a CDA, and so we'll go from there. And I think, Jason, you've said this before, I think if a buyer's agent approaches you and says they have a buyer's rep, I think we have a right to request proof of that through our MLS if we think that they're fudging. But Jason, can you clarify there?
Yeah, if someone asks you for your buyer's rep, you don't have to provide it. You can just say, yes, I have one, and that suffices. But it's most likely going to play out where title companies are going to start wanting buyer's reps, so they know who to pay who on CDAs. So I think it would come to light when, let's say, the buyer's brokerage sends in a CDA and is only closing at 2, then the title company is going to say, wait a minute, what is this about? Where does that extra 1% go? And the contract now says that extra 1% goes back to the seller.
Right.
Well, even if I had an agreement with my buyer to take 2% at the least, I would ask for 3% on every offer I would submit. No,
you need to request, whatever it is the buyer has agreed you should get paid. If you called this listing broker, and we're gonna talk about this.
okay, I figured you would.
No. But if you do, you can amend your buyer's rep to increase to 3, but you need to ask for whatever your agreement says for.
Okay.
Because one of the other elements of the settlement is that a buyer's agent cannot collect more than what's on the buyer's rep. So that's
Correct.
in the plan.
Yeah. Okay, that's a good question. And so we'll get there. So then just to point out to you guys, this is 5B. Well, first of all, 5.3 was a new paragraph, and it says that seller authorizes broker to publicly disclose compensation, which means we can post on our website. If we have a number up here, we are free to advertise it. It just can't go in the MLS. This fourth paragraph was a new addition, and what it says, because the previous agreement version was confusing because it didn't really discuss like the non-represented buyer or an intermediary situation. And so we had told you guys, just fill out all of the paperwork as if it was a different broker. And now you don't have to do that because this basically says that broker will retain amounts specified in 5A1 as broker's fee if there is no other broker that procures the buyer, including intermediary situations or where the buyer is represented. So that's saying if you have 6% here and an unrepresented buyer comes, then the broker retains that amount. And then it says amount specified in 5A2A will be applied towards any fee a buyer's has paid in a separate written representation agreement. So basically in an intermediary situation, like you're covered and you don't have to do any additional paperwork as long as the listing agreement covers the cost of the buyer's fee. And we'll get into that. But basically this clarifies intermediary and non-disclosed broker situations, whereas before it was kind of confusing and silent. Okay. So this is the situation where, you know, maybe your seller said, I'm not comfortable offering 3, but I'll offer 2.5. So this is just an example of how to fill that out. It's 5.5 total administration fee, 2.5 subagent, still always 0. Okay. And so that's, and then just to be clear here, sorry, I should have checked this box. We do want to say seller does authorize broker to disclose, generally speaking, to disclose that they're willing to consider contributing an amount. So if your seller said, well, I only want to offer 2.5 up front, but if we get the right offer and the buyer agent is asking 3, I would entertain that. Then you do want to be authorized to disclose that. So as a general rule of thumb, you're going to check this box that you do want to be authorized to like talk to other brokers and prospective buyers about what the seller is willing to pay. So generally speaking, you do want to be authorized there to discuss. Okay. Questions? I'm looking over here because that's where I see all the pictures of you guys. Okay, so now this is the situation where your seller has said, you know what, like I don't want to offer any compensation up front. I may or may not pay it depending on what the offer looks like. So let's just say 0. I'll for sure pay you your 3% and your admin fee. So this is how you fill that out there. If you're saying we're not offering anything to another broker up front, then you're just going to fill out 5B. And again, but since he said, yeah, I would be willing to consider it, you do want to be authorized. Again, like I think 99.9% of the time, you're going to want to check this box here. That you are authorized to kind of discuss that. Now, this is a big change from the previous version, is that you guys might remember in the old version, this paragraph was in 11F, like pages and pages away, which made no sense. So they moved up, they moved this up to the rest of compensation, which was very intuitive and was a good change. So 11F is not there anymore and it's got moved up here. Okay. And just to be clear, because we had this conversation we were discussing, you're never going to be in a situation where you're filling out 5A and 5B. It's one or the other. And this says this up here. The seller is either agreeing to offer something upfront to the buyer's broker or they're not. You're never going to be in a situation where you're filling out both. Okay. Let me look at the questions in the chat. How will we know what the buyer's rep agreement states? You're gonna be talking to the agents on the other side of the deal for sure. Patty's asked a perfect question. Do we need to complete the addendum for the seller to authorize marketing of compensation in addition to the listing agreement? The answer to that is no, because, you know, 5A3 now protects you that you're authorized to do that. And also, if you have checked this box, seller does authorize broker, you're covered there as well. The document she's asking about, let me show it to you guys. Document she's asking about is this one. And it's a pre-existing document. It's actually not really new, but we would say you really only need to use this in very limited cases. Sorry, this needs to go away. I need to fix this form, fix this slide. You're only gonna use this in limited situations if you wanna advertise something specific. For example, like if you wanna advertise that the seller is like having the roof repaired, or will do something like that before closing. If you wanna get in writing that you're advertising something specific, then you would use this form, but you don't need it just for compensation. That's a great question. And then Jackie's also asking, she has new listing agreements. She has a new list agreement that's not on the new form. You don't have to do anything to update it. So you're fine there. Let me find what slide I was on. But that's a good question. No. Obviously, if you had one that was signed before June 24th, we're in that time period now where it is required where you have executed that amendment to bring it current. But if you have used the June 24th form or newer, you're fine. You just need to, going forward, start using this August form. So, okay. Beverly's asking if we have a listing agreement valid through 12/31, should we replace it with a new form or just do an amendment to the current one? I mean, if it doesn't expire on 12/31 and you executed it after on the June 24th or after form, like you're fine, you don't have to do anything. When it comes to the end of the year, if you need to renew, you can just do an extension. You don't have to do a totally new form, but that's a good question. Okay. Moving on, we are going to get to specific scenarios, I promise you, but I want to walk through the new buyer's rep also, and just talk to you strategically about how to fill it up. So, you know, there's different forms that Texas Association of Realtors has put forward for us to use. We are only using the long form. The short form is more designated for agents that just want to get paid to show properties, which is not really what you guys do. You guys are in the like relationship building and advising business, not the door opening business. So we only use the long form. That said, we understand there are times when you're still like dating your client, or you just want to go and look at a couple houses and they're a little bit shy of like signing a extensive agreement. So you can make this form very narrow by adjusting the market area and the term of the agreement. And so you can make the market area as specific as 1 house or 3 houses. That's fine. If you're just getting to know someone, obviously, once you go out the first weekend and you look at those 4 houses and they're like, yeah, we want to work with you, you're going to have to amend this and expand the market area. And that's fine. With respect to the term, I would recommend, even if you're doing a narrow market area, to at least make the term like 60 to 90 days, because if you go and show them that house and they want to put an offer, you want your representation of them for that specific house to last longer than just the weekend, right? So that if you show them a house and they end up buying it, you want to, you know, be able to represent them in that offer and go forward. So that would be my recommendation. Try to get it for like 60 days or something. Then you're not hugely tying them up, but you at least, if they want to make an offer on that house, you're protected, and it's not just for the weekend. And then on Monday, they can go and write an offer with the listing agent because you don't represent them anymore. Does that make sense? Okay. Okay, so that's kind of how to make the agreement narrow. And then this is the broker compensation section. And this one didn't change a lot from the previous version. It's just the broker's fee, how much you're going to charge, 3%. The one change that they did make, which is helpful for us, is that they added in this blank where you can write in other compensation. And that's where we can stick our administrative fee. One thing, and to Angela's point, like our compensation has to be like clear. It can't be a range. So you can't say like whatever the seller is offering or something like that. It has to be a number. So we encourage you guys to articulate your value to your buyers, get it signed at 3. If you're ever in a situation where the seller is not offering 3, you can negotiate for it and try really hard to get that compensation covered by the seller. There's different ways, even if they're not offering that upfront. So, question about how to fill this out. Is this making sense? Pretty straightforward. Okay. All right. Okay, so these are.
I have a quick question.
Yeah, what's up?
So if they're offering less than 3% and the buyer rep says 3, will Briggs unilaterally agree to reduce? Or are we going to get pushback from the broker?
No, that's a good question. Well, so there's ways for you to, I think that's gonna start it's possible that that's gonna start happening more and more. And so you guys need to, there are other, even if they're only offering 3, you can still ask them to pay that additional 1 and get yourself covered. And it just depends on the value of the quality of the offer
What
and to the seller. So.
What if the seller's offering 0? I mean,
Yeah, so if the seller's offering 0, like that's a strategic question for them, and we're gonna talk about all these situations. That doesn't mean that you may have that one seller out there that's like, I'm not paying buyer broker compensation, I don't believe in it, I've read the news, and then it's like, okay, well, a lot of buyers, that seller's cutting themselves off from a lot of buyers because they don't have the additional cash to pay their broker, and most buyers are working with brokers. But there's ways to request that the seller pay. I mean, if you have $1 million listing and they're like, we're paying 0, well, if you offer $1,030,000, then they could cover your commission, right? So there's ways to ask for it. We're gonna go through them specifically.
Okay.
It's a good question. No problem. Okay, so these are the best practices for the way to write the offers. And we understand you guys are out there like doing this right now, and every brokerage is probably doing it differently. Like, Angela, Jennifer, John, Jason, and I put our heads together and figured out, like, based on what this paperwork says, like, what is the right way to approach this? And we have confirmed with the Texas Association of Realtors that the way we're teaching you guys how to do this is the way that they intended these forms to be used. So we are doing it properly. I guarantee you, I've already heard a million stories that you guys are going to get pushback about the way people are doing it, but this is the right way to do it. So try to do it this way if you can. Definitely on the buyer side, you should do it this way because this is the only way to protect yourself. So the first thing you need to do is figure out, like, if you're showing
Zareen?
houses, yeah.
I'm sorry, quick question. This is Carla Tressler.
Carla.
Sorry, Alex and I are sharing a screen. So with regard to that, calling the listing broker and determining the commission, we had a client who's going to be listing soon, and they were asking, well, if we are willing to pay, potentially up to, let's just hypothetically say 3%, then to a buyer's agent, but we don't want that disclosed, then which of the scenarios on those forms are you checking? Because what they were saying is they would like to just say yes when someone calls us and says, hey, another agent calls and says, is your seller offering to offer, commission? And you say, well, yes, they are. And on the amount, it's going to be contingent on the offer.
Yeah. And
Can you say that?
Yeah. If you look at my screen right now, in
Yes.
that case where the seller is not willing to commit to any amount upfront, then I would fill it out this way, 5B. And the response is like, he's not offering anything upfront, but I am authorized to disclose that he is absolutely willing to pay commissions with the right offer. And then that's really up to the buyer and their broker to submit their request with their offer. And we're going to walk through how to do that.
So
but I would do it that way.
You're saying, because I thought you said when you were talking about 5A, I thought you had said that even if the seller puts in hypothetically 3% of the sales price, that depending on the offer, they could change that and say no, depending on the offer, it was less. I thought that was
if they fill out this version, they're pretty much bound to offer that, but they can always decline an offer and say, I'm sorry, but at that purchase price with that much commission in there, it's just not netting the seller what they need to net, and they either need to up their offer or come back and reduce their commission and request less. Does that make sense? But in your case where the seller has said, I really don't want to advertise, you're safest just doing 5B and saying that you are authorized to disclose that they're willing to pay that. And honestly, I'm married to someone that would do it that way. He would say, I'm not offering anything up front. I will pay with the right offer. And then it's just up to me as the listing agent to say, when you reach out to me, say, look, we're not offering any upfront, but the seller is happy to pay a commission depending on the offer. And that to me is a perfectly reasonable position, as long as the seller understands that there are likely buyers out there that are like, I don't want to see houses if the seller's not willing to pay anything. The challenge is that if that box that says like the listing broker is authorized to say that the seller might consider, then even if it says 0, they technically are willing to consider paying something. And so obviously we should be showing every house regardless what the commission says, and those are conversations we need to have with our buyers upfront. So,
When that agent calls you and says, and you have that scenario that I was just talking about, can you word it slightly different? Can you say they have stated that they are willing to offer a commission, but the amount would be contingent on the offer? Or
yeah.
do you have to say, no, they are not offering a commission up front? To me, those
Well,
just seem like very
yeah,
different
you can-
words.
I think you can say, well, I think the question they're calling to ask you is, have you already agreed to something up front? And the answer is, you have not agreed to something up front. So you can say like, our listing agreement doesn't have a number, but my seller is very willing to compensate a buyer's broker with the right offer.
Got it. Okay, so
so
you can
that's-
say they are willing, even though,
Yeah,
meaning with the
absolutely.
right
And that's
offer.
what that does authorize you to say that. Good
And
question.
this is my last question. Are we going to have, because obviously we know the effect that that could have with agents that are maybe not as ethical and maybe won't show a certain house unless they have a flat out agreement of, X% before they walk in it. Are we going to have it? And I mean, we can speculate about that, but is there any way to have any hard data on that after a few months? Like which houses are sitting on the market longer, et cetera? And I realize that might be for a different call. I just didn't know if overall there's going to be any way, because obviously
I
we
mean,
can't have it on
no, there's not
MLS.
going to be an official way to collect that other than looking
Okay.
at closing statements and, anecdotally and calling and knowing and talking to other brokerages and kind of asking what they got paid when we're looking at comps, right?
Okay.
So we'll go to there. Okay. I see the questions. I'm not ignoring you. We're gonna get through the material and then we'll go through all the questions and stay as long as we need to, okay? I just don't wanna get too far in the weeds and get distracted reading questions. So, okay. So the first step is, you need to figure out when you're about to go show houses, like what is the buyer's agent commission, right? So you either can look at their website. A lot of them are up now, not all of them are up. They may not be sharing on their website and they may always want you to call, but like I know all the, Berkshire Hathaway, Ebby, all of those companies, they have it up now. We have it up. Compass doesn't have it up yet, but so you can look at the website or you can call a listing broker, which is not a bad habit to get into, is to start communicating with listing brokers, right? When you're showing their properties and, so do that first and then show the house. And obviously if the buyer's agent commission is less than what is agreed to in your buyer's rep, you should give your buyer a heads up. And maybe I had this conversation with an agent the other day. They're like, I don't want to do that every house I go show. It's like, okay, that's fine. But then you need to have a conversation with them in the original buyer consultation of how do you want to handle these? And then go from there. And they may be like, no, I want to know before I see the house if this is going to be a factor. But I think given that we can negotiate to get all the commission paid from the seller, even if they're not offering up front, this should not be like a huge significant factor. So we'll see. Okay, so then, you show the house. Once the buyer decides to make an offer, your next step is to get the compensation agreement between brokers executed prior to making the offer. And this is where this document, the compensation agreement between brokers, is replacing that unilateral binding offer of commission that was in the MLS and isn't anymore. So it's basically, remember we used to make you guys, we probably still do, but make a copy of the MLS sheet and load it into the file because we wanted a record so that they didn't go and change that number real quickly or whatever. So you need to get this document executed in a perfect world prior to making the offer, so you know what they're offering. And then you can write your offer. And even if your buyer's rep says 3, if you call them and they're like, this seller has agreed to pay 2 upfront, then you just write the compensation agreement for whatever the seller has said that they're willing to pay. And then any delta you can ask for in this next document we're going to talk about. So get the compensation agreement between brokers signed upfront. This is not a part of the offer. This is a document that's signed between the brokers. It is not signed between the 2 parties, right? The buyer and seller don't sign that document. It just documents the agreement that we are going to have with the other broker. And then when you write your offer, you're going to include the addendum regarding broker's fees. That's going to be part now of every offer, unless it's an unrepresented buyer, or if the listing agent and neither the listing broker nor the seller are paying any of the buyer agent commission. So it's probably going to be pretty rare that your contracts don't have this document in here. Okay. We're going to look at what that looks like next. So check the box in paragraph 22 of the TREC contract form and reference this addendum regarding broker's fees. So this is just what this looks like. Obviously, this is the section in our 1 to 4. And you're gonna check this box and you're gonna, most of the time now, you're gonna have this addendum regarding brokers' fees. As part of the contract, if either the seller or the listing broker is paying, any of the buyer's broker compensation. Okay? Questions there? Okay,
Can you
Okay.
go back?
go back where? What's the question?
Back to the, not that visual, yeah, right
Yeah,
there.
I'm gonna save all of these slides as a PDF and send them to you guys. So we'll send you the
Okay.
PDF of the slides and the recording of the class. So you're squared away. You don't have to take pictures or anything. Okay, so now we're gonna look at these forms and how to fill them out. And this is what the compensation agreement between brokers looks like. This is the new version. You can see it's 823. And basically, this is the agreement. You can see the parties that's signing it are the two brokers, listing broker and cooperating broker, the buyer's broker. And you put the property address, you put the name of the parties, and this is what this document looks like. And this one did not really change substantively. It changed like one word change, so it's not a huge change from what you saw. But this is the document where the buyer and the seller sign it. This is the addendum regarding broker's fees that does become part of the contract, which is why we write it into that paragraph 22. And this one changed substantively in that there's this new section that discusses intermediary fees. So, and we're gonna get into really what that says, but I just wanted you to see those two documents and know that the compensation agreement between brokers documents the fees between what the listing broker has got the seller to agree to in advance, right? That's always the number that goes there. And then this is the document where we're gonna, say what that amount is and then any additional, and we'll walk through what this looks like. Okay. Okay, perfect. So now we're gonna go through, perfect. We have half an hour to kind of talk through scenarios and look at the paperwork. Real quick, let me just go through the questions. So if you have a relationship with a buyer and you want to represent them for only 2%, are you still recommending we have to put 3 just in case seller would be offering that? Or can we keep our buyer at 2 and then amend it on a case-by-case basis? Yeah, I think it makes sense to, I guess the question is, especially now that the seller is going to keep the 1% and the listing broker isn't, I think in a perfect world, we see 3% is being offered a lot. So we think our position is that if you have it signed at 2 and the seller is offering 3, the likelihood of you increasing that amount and then getting to keep it is slim to none. It's better to put it at 3 and then have to reduce it down if necessary. And we'll talk about that exact situation, but I mean, it's really your call, but to your point, yes, if your buyer rep is ever different than what the seller is offering and you want to increase it to what the seller is offering, you would have to amend it before you requested it, because that's part of our agreement. We can't request to be paid more than what the buyer has agreed to. Okay. Would we fill in 3% in A?
Amend buyer rep.
Okay, if they sign an agreement for 2%, they can simply agree to go up depending on the offer. They can, but realistically, now that the listing agreement says that any
Amend
overage goes to
buyer
the
rep.
seller, they're probably not gonna agree to that, right? Because the seller is netting more. And that makes their offer more attractive. So if you sign your buyer's rep for less, getting them to increase it, we think is probably gonna be a challenge. Getting your buyer to increase it. So, all right, Jeremy, if I don't get to your question, bring it back up, but hopefully we'll cover it. Jackie says, I have a listing and someone comes to my open house and wants to make an offer through me. That's fine. So there's two, now that, we have to have a signed buyer's rep before we can show properties. The two exceptions to that are open houses and on your own listing. You can show your own listing to a buyer without a rep. Then if they want you to make an offer through you, that makes you an intermediary without appointment. I will tell you right now, like, we really, really, really discourage that because of the amount of liability involved, and because we think most agents don't understand, like, really what you're allowed to do in that situation, which is not a whole heck of a lot, other than pushing papers back and forth. So yes, if that happens, Jackie, what you would do is you would sign a buyer's rep agreement with that buyer where they agree to intermediary. Presumably your seller has already agreed to intermediary, and then you basically just paper it up without giving anyone any counsel. And that's what that looks like. Okay, I think we're caught up on questions. Jeremy, if I don't cover what you needed covered, we'll talk it through at the end, okay?
Serene,
Yeah.
I have a question.
Mhm.
So I'm in a situation right now where I have a buyer and I called and asked if they're paying compensation to buyer's agent, and that it was one of those, well, they're willing to with depending on the your offer. So we're under contract and everything, but I couldn't do the compensation agreement prior to submitting the offer because it was dependent on that. So now we have in the contract what they're going to pay me. Do we need to go back and fill out the compensation between brokers?
Well, no, because in that case, the seller was offering 0 through the listing broker. But if the seller has agreed to pay you in the contract, then the seller is gonna pay you directly. It's not passing through the listing broker. So, and there's a form that addresses that situation, which we're about to cover. I mean, the form, this is that addendum regarding broker's fees is what should have been used there. If it wasn't, I mean, if it's,
And we did do that. We attached that to the
yeah,
contract.
so there's not, if there's no compensation being offered through the broker, like in Carla's like 0% situation, there will be no compensation agreement between brokers because the listing broker isn't getting anything to pass on to the buyer's broker. It's all coming directly from the seller. So that's a good point, is
That
that,
makes sense because they're on ReChat, they're still telling me that form is required from me.
okay, yeah, no, we can explain that to them if that's a nuance that someone's not understanding. Yeah, if there's no
Serene.
compensation coming from the listing broker to the buyer's broker, you don't need that form.
Hey,
Good point.
Zareen,
Yeah,
because this is so new, can you hear me?
I'm sorry, I couldn't hear you. Repeat that, please.
Okay, how about now?
Yeah.
You can hear me now, or you
Yeah, I
can't?
can hear you.
Okay. What I was going to tag on to that conversation is that because this is so new, I wonder if we're going to see case people are saying that, but at the end, when everybody's getting paid, the compensation is coming from the broker. Do you agree with that?
No, I mean, it's pretty straightforward with the paperwork, and there should be none of this should be like at the end. All of this, the whole point of the lawsuit, I think, is that all of this stuff needs to be discussed much more openly and directly up front. And this document, when we look at the addendum regarding brokers' fees, I think and really walk through how to fill it out, I think it'll be clarifying. So hold that thought, Barbara, and we'll get back to it. And if it still doesn't make sense at the end, yeah, Jason, thanks for that answering question. Lee asked a question about, if the buyer wants to not be represented and we don't want to do intermediary and the buyer just represents themselves or doesn't have representation, we do have this acknowledgement of non-representation. Those situations are also fraught with liability, so you need to be really careful, because if you're the person, even if you don't represent them and they've signed this one piece of paper that says acknowledgement of non-representation, if you're like ushering them through the whole transaction and totally helping them, like, on a witness stand, they're a very jury friendly plaintiff who feels like they got taken advantage of, even if they did sign one piece of paper that says I'm representing myself, right? So just be careful. But yes, we do have a document that's a little bit of a CYA for us there. Okay, so let's walk through these and then we'll see how if this clears up some of the questions. So let's walk through just a few different scenarios. So the first scenario is you have a buyer's rep and what's in your buyer's rep is equal to what the seller is offering. So let's just say your buyer's rep says 3, seller is offering 3. Great. We're gonna complete the compensation agreement between brokers before we write the offer, just to document that the listing broker told us it was 3 and that they'll pay us 3. We're gonna add that addendum regarding broker's fees for the buyer and seller to sign, and that's for information purposes only. And then in box 22 of the contract, we're gonna say, yeah, this addendum regarding broker's fees is part of the contract. Like, that's the steps. It's that easy, right? So in your compensation agreement between brokers, you fill out, listing broker, buyer broker, what's the property address, what's the buyer's name, right? So you're registering this particular buyer with this listing broker. And then, the agreement starts on, you can make it the date you're writing the offer, you can make it the date you showed the house, you can make it the beginning of the buyer's rep. It just needs to predate the offer, right? And it ends, I would make it end at the end of the buyer's rep term. So for as long as you represent this buyer, you will be compensated by this broker if they buy the house. That's my recommendation of what to put in that blank, the end of your buyer's rep term. And then, how much are they paying you? The cooperating broker, is paying 3, right? That we talked to them, they said 3, so we fill out 3. As the buyer's agent, we send it over to the listing broker, they sign it, great, we're ready to go, we're gonna write our offer. We have agents asking like, oh, well, I got an offer and this wasn't attached. Here's the deal, like, this document protects you as the buyer's agent. This is replacing what was in the MLS before. So if there's nothing in the MLS to protect us and they told us 3 over the phone, or there is a text message, that's not really very helpful. We want a writing from the listing broker that says, yes, we will pay you this amount. And that's how you're protected, is getting this document signed. Which is why we recommend doing it upfront before you write your offer. Are there going to be circumstances where you send everything over to the listing broker all at once? Yes. It is highly, highly recommended to get this signed up front, because you don't want them to change what they're offering, based on your offer. You want to get it signed up front and then go from there. Okay, so that's what the compensation agreement between brokers looks like. You get that signed with the listing broker. And then with respect to the contract and what the buyer and the seller are going to see, you're going to fill out this addendum regarding broker's fees. And you're going to say, hey, in this case, we're getting paid in Dallas County because that's where our brokerage is headquartered. And then you're going to say D1, the listing broker will pay 3%. And you'll know this was a change in the new version of the forms. The specified amount is for informational purposes only. It does not change compensation specified in written compensation agreements. So if, you called them and they said 2 and you write in 3 or their compensation agreement says 2, you're not being sneaky. It's just whatever you have signed in the compensation agreement is what you're going to get paid from the listing broker. This is just for the seller and the buyer to see what that number is. So that's what that looks like. Pretty straightforward. Any questions? Okay, so that's our best case scenario where it's 3 and 3. Emily, did you have something?
Yeah, sorry. So if they sign that, you're saying, and they put 3%, but in negotiations, the listing, they can change it? Like, this isn't binding? Is that what you're saying?
No, this is what's binding is the compensation agreement between brokers. This is what's binding, right? The listing broker told you they would pay you that much. So
Okay.
they are bound to that. This is just so the seller and the buyer can see what you guys agreed to, right?
Gotcha.
And that's not a surprise to the seller, because the seller knows what they're offering the buyer's broker through the listing broker, because they signed the listing agreement, right?
Yes, I got you.
Okay, perfect. Okay, so let's do a little bit more complicated situation. So this is a situation where the seller is offering less than what is in your buyer's rep. So the seller is offering 2, but your buyer's rep says 3. So you are going to, first things first, you're always going to just document whatever the seller and the listing agent have already agreed to in that compensation agreement between brokers is what you're gonna, so if they said 2, it's like, great, prepare the compensation agreement between brokers for 2. And then get it signed. And then we still have that outstanding 1%. So we're going to have to figure out how to figure that out. So you're going to use the addendum regarding broker's fees. You're going to check the box in paragraph 22 and reference it. And then you have 3 options for that delta, right? The 1%. You can request the fee directly from the sellers using the addendum regarding broker's fees. Your buyer can pay it, right? The buyer can say, well, I don't mind paying you 1%, outside of the purchase price. Or you could amend the buyer's rep down to 2% specifically for that property only and just accept getting paid less. Hopefully that's the worst case scenario. And the best case scenario is that we can get the seller to pay it. Or the buyer is like, I don't mind paying you 1%. I think you're worth the 3% that I originally agreed to. And that, here's what the paperwork looks like. So you have, you know, compensation agreement between brokers, property, buyer name, you know, all of this. And then you said, you know what, the seller said 2%. So even though my buyer's rep says 3, they have already agreed to 2. So I'm at least collecting this 2% from the listing broker and covering my base there as the buyer's rep. I'm protected once I get this signed on that 2%. And now when I write my offer to submit to the seller from the buyer, I'm gonna say, the seller is gonna pay 2%, which we've already documented, right? And also, we're saying the seller will pay an additional 1% towards other brokers' fees. So that way you're getting 2 from the listing broker and 1% directly from the seller. Okay, and then you're covered for the full 3%. The circumstance under which you would use 2A is if this is for FSBOs or like one-time showing a registration agreement between broker and owner, right? This is that situation. That's the only time you're going to use 2A. So really you're going to be using D1 the most because it's compensation. That's what, you know, that's when the seller is paying you through the listing broker from the listing agreement. Or D2B is when you're asking for additional funds from the seller to pay more of the buyer's agent commission. Questions there? Okay. Catherine says on form
Hey,
24.
Doreen,
Yeah,
those forms, just so nobody like, you know, just automatic, but those are in the wrong blanks. They need to be in those are under the dollar blanks. And I think on a previous form, it was.
oh,
also-
you're right. I need to, when I updated the PowerPoint, this needs to scoot over. You're right. That was the
Right.
change.
And then I think it was.
You want to
on-
get paid more than $2. Good catch. Thank you. I'll scoot those over before I save the PowerPoint and send it to you guys. Thanks, Diane. Good catch. Yeah, that's confusing. I wonder if they've been like that all along or if they switched them in this version. I don't remember. If they have been like that all along, no one has noticed in all of these classes we've done. Okay, so let's talk about a situation when seller is offering no buyer's agent's commission upfront, 0%. And your buyer's rep says 3. This is the Carla situation. Like I said, this is the way my husband would do it. He would say, I'm not agreeing to any amount until I see the offer. And that's fine. That doesn't mean that they're not open-minded to paying it. They just want to see the offer first and are not willing to offer anything upfront. And that's fine. The listing agent has a little bit higher of a hurdle to climb to convince people to show it and that they will pay, but it's not catastrophic if you guys see 0, okay? And you need to be coaching your buyers to that effect as well. So, because at the end of the day, it's all about what the seller nets, right? Like I said, with $1 million offer, $1,030,000 covers the commission. So it's just all about the net to the seller. So the first, you have 2 options here. You know, you can have the buyer pay the fee directly. There will be no addendum regarding broker's fees. And we'll submit the CDA, you know, requesting that the buyer bring the funds. And just if that's happening to you, you just need to make sure that you are in close communication with the buyer's lender, that they do in fact have sufficient funds to bring that commission for you, okay? So that's one option. The other option is you request the fee from the seller using the addendum regarding broker's fees in D2B. And I think this is really what we contemplate here. Sorry, I don't know why that's duplicated, but here we go. And this is what you would do. You would say, okay, you said like if I was writing an offer on Carla's listing and it's a great offer, and my buyer didn't want to come out of pocket, they wanted it to be part of the purchase price and for the seller to pay it, I would just write, you know, D2B 3%. Sorry, it should be over here. That's a huge fail, but I'll fix that. So I would be asking the seller to pay 3%. And you can see this option creates a new obligation for sellers. This was not something that they had agreed to up front, but it's something that we are asking them to do in addition. And if the buyer and seller sign it, we're good to go.
I have a quick question right there, please.
Sure.
If that situation, like you said, your husband would not offer it up front and someone's seller wasn't, is it gonna on our website, it won't say 0% or is not offering it. What would that look like then?
It's a
If
good
it was,
question. I think Maria's on this call and is gonna talk about what our website options are. I mean, I think it will say 0% unless we don't want it to. Maria, are you here and plugged in at this moment?
I am here and enraptured by all of this. I'll put on my video. I think because we put that in manually. So it's really what you put into the listing that you send, into listing. So if you want 0, it'll say 0. We're also adding where you can put in a comment, it could be, seller willing to consider. We also have a
Just
disclaimer
please
on the
call listing
website.
bro- Yeah, I would say, please call listing.
Yeah,
agent
please
in
call
that
listing broker.
situation. I wouldn't
Perfect.
probably ever put 0. I would say, please call
Right.
listing.
super,
Yeah.
thank you.
But
Yeah,
you can
but I
put
think
that in.
even if you see 0 on someone else's website, it's always worth a call. Because that agent is gonna be like, yes, please bring me an offer. We'll try to get you, so I think in a perfect world that you don't promote 0, but you just say, please call the agent, and then they can, go from there. I will say we haven't seen a lot of 0, so it's not something that I've seen on our website. Yeah, the lesson is that it's all negotiable. Amen. Okay, so that's how that gets filled out. You just request that the seller pay whatever's in the buyer's rep in that case.
So I have a quick question about where the buyer's paying. Would that ever hold up a closing? I mean, if the buyer and the lender bring funds to fulfill the amount in the contract to purchase the home, but not enough to cover your commission, would the home still close in funds?
Because what's gonna happen is, the lender and the title company, like days before closing, are gonna work, hopefully days before closing, are gonna work on the closing statement, and the buyer's gonna see that, cash from buyer number, and the title company is gonna tell them what they need to bring. So it's only gonna hold up the closing if the buyer's agent has been in touch with the buyer's lender and the buyer doesn't have the funds. But other than that, it's just a number of what's the cash amount that the buyer needs to bring, and that'll be on the closing statement, and it'll be clear.
But they're not borrowing the money to pay your commission. They're coming out of that with cash. The lending is not going to allow them to borrow to pay commission, right?
Not currently.
Yeah.
So yes, correct.
Thank you.
Okay. All right. Okay, so now here's a situation that Beverly was asking about, which we, please know this should not happen. Our best practice for you guys is to negotiate our full 3% plus the admin fee on your buyer's rep agreement. It's a lot easier to amend it down than it is to amend it up and get to keep that money. So, the compensation agreement should match whatever the seller is offering. But you can ask for more, so you can amend your buyer's rep up. But then the buyer likely will be like, well, I want that money back, right? And the buyer may say, well, you rebate that to me, or, and if you want to rebate it, we have a way to do that, that's fine. So you just need to be mindful. I mean, it's a difficult situation to put yourself in, to say, oh, the seller is offering 3, but we only agreed to 2. Will you increase it? Because the buyer is going to say, well, if the seller is offering more, I want you to credit it back to me. So, and now the listing agreement provides that if the seller is offering 3 and the buyer's rep only says 2, then the seller gets to keep that 1%, and the buyer may be like, I'm happy with that because it makes my offer better. So you can only ask in the compensation agreement between brokers, what does your buyer's rep say? So you either have to amend the buyer's rep up, in which case the buyer will probably ask for a rebate, or you can just ask for what is in there. Okay. How are we doing on time? Oh, close. Okay. Okay, so now this is a change, and this is a new form. It's not a new form. It's a change in the existing form for intermediaries. And we briefly touched on this, but basically, if Kyle Richards has a listing and I write an offer, and that's obviously an intermediary, and his listing says 3% and my buyer's rep says 3%, then we don't have to sign anything else. because it's all covered already, right? Like the seller has agreed to pay 6% to Briggs Freeman, and Briggs Freeman is gonna sort it out between me and Kyle, 3 and 3, right? So we are good there. We don't need anything else. You are gonna need, you do fill out this just to say how much, you fill this out only if you're in a situation where if Kyle's agreement said 0, and I write an offer as a Briggs Freeman agent, we would put 3 in here, because he's gonna pay, nothing as agreed in the listing agreement, so we're creating a new obligation for him to pay me my 3% as the buyer's broker. So you only need this paragraph E if what's already in the listing agreement doesn't cover the buyer's broker commission. Does that make sense? So realistically, hopefully you won't need intermediary situations. You won't need this addendum regarding broker's fees because you, it's already in the listing agreement, what the listing side's gonna get paid and what the buyer side's gonna get paid. But if you're ever in a situation where the listing agreement doesn't cover the full buyer's rep charge in an intermediary, you need to fill out this paragraph E.
And so for those of you guys who took the class the last couple of weeks before these changes took place, we had been telling you if it was an intermediary situation to go ahead and use the 2402 compensation between brokers, even though it didn't really make sense. So this change eliminated that requirement. So.
Thank you. Yes, exactly. And then I put this in here just so you guys could see. This is the intermediary relationship notice form you're going to use. It's the same form that we've had since January of 04. I put the red line in so you could see the difference. This is the new version. This does not satisfy the written consent requirement to act as intermediary. You must first obtain consent. And we do that in our representation documents, right? And this form is just intended to notify the parties that the broker is going to be an intermediary and who's representing who. So there you go. All right. So now, Patty's asking, let's get to questions. Patty's asking, how do we as the buyer's agent know what the listing agreement states? You can look at their website or you can call the listing agent and ask. That's how we know. So what other questions do we have?
Can you kind of touch again upon people requesting your buyer rep agreement from listing agents? Is that something they're allowed to do? And I've also heard that lenders are asking for them as well.
Has anyone had a lender ask for the buyer's rep agreement?
Mm-mm.
Like your own buyers is asking, Emily?
Yes, it hasn't happened to me. I have just heard of it happening. And I guess it's so they can, I don't know if it's part of the qualification, like if they're having to see who's paying who.
I mean, I would
so
hope
worried about
that
the buyer
the
having
buyer's rep is in close enough communication with the buyer's lender that the buyer's lender has no doubt about what the buyer's agent compensation is, right? I mean, you guys should be in super close contact. So if they want to see a buyer's rep agreement, they're not secret documents, like you are able to, you don't have to. But if Ashton called me and I was working with them, if I had sent a buyer to Ashton, I can't imagine Ashton calling me and being like, hey Z, can I see your buyer's rep? I'd be like, I told you we agreed to 3%, right? I guess I don't understand the question.
Hey, Zareen.
Yeah.
Sorry, it's Alex. Hey, can't you just, they're going to get a copy of the addendum regarding broker's fees document that specifies that. So
Yeah,
that should be
I
all the lender
agree.
needs.
Yeah, and I don't think title companies are gonna request representation agreements either unless there's like a discrepancy. But that's what the purpose of this addendum regarding brokers fees is to say like who's getting paid what from how much. The only amount that's not covered there is when the buyer's paying their broker directly, and that's gonna come in the CDA from the buyer's broker. So
And what about listing agents asking buyer agents for their,
Asking to see your buyer's rep?
yeah,
Well, I think that's, go ahead, Jason.
Yeah, I would say that according to Trek, that just answering that with a yes, just answering that yes suffices your code of ethics. So you don't have to send it to the listing agent. You can just say, yes, I have them in place. If they would really want to get a copy of it, technically they're supposed to request it from the local board of realtors. So wherever that is, Metro Tech, CCAR, whoever. And then the board of realtors has the ability to request it from the broker. Which is why we've got the system in place now where we want you to be emailing in your buyer's reps to buyer rep at breaksagreement.com, so that we have copies of them. So that if we get a call from Metro Tex, that Angela or one of the other managers has the ability to go find it and produce it. But no, you don't. If another agent asks you for it, simply answering the question, yes, I have one, suffices the code of ethics. So you don't have to send them one if you don't want to.
and if they ask what the amount is for, do we have to tell them that, or can we say, or we don't have to tell?
That I don't know. I'll have to ask.
What
I
was
don't
the
see why
question?
you would have to
The
tell them
scenario of what-
what's agreed to in the contracts.
Yeah.
They may want to know before,
But
you
that's-
know, I just heard this happening. They may want to know before, so when they decide what the seller is going to offer, it may be dependent on what your rep agreement says.
No one can see.
I personally wouldn't tell them anything. I'd be like, just depending on,
I wouldn't either.
here's the offer I'm gonna present you, present it to your client.
Yeah, I don't want to share it either. I just want to make sure we don't have to.
No, I know for sure we don't, so.
Okay, we had a good question from Beverly. So she, and I love this question. So she said, say you're dealing with a buyer making a stretch to afford to buy and they can't pay you the 3% you put in the buyer's rep if seller is offering. So you agreed with them to take only 2 if needed. How do you assure them that they won't owe you more? That's a good question. And I think the answer to that question is that this is what you say. You say, well, first of all, I think you say to them, you know, the majority of what we're seeing right now is that sellers are offering to pay 3%. And that is typically what I would charge. So I would like to collect my full fee if the seller is offering that. If we get in a situation, and then the next step is like, even if they're not offering a full 3, there are mechanisms in the contract where we can request that they pay my full fee. If we get down the line in negotiations and we just can't get them to cover my full fee, I'm not gonna stand in the way of you purchasing your dream home, and I will work with you there. And hopefully you have the rapport. If they're like, nope, absolutely not, then you can do it at 2 if that's how you want to spend your time. But I think, you know, if you kind of explain to them, like, we're seeing a lot of 3. So, and that's typically what I charge. So I would like to try for that. We, even if they're not offering 3, we are able to negotiate for the seller to pay it. And if we ever get in a situation where we just can't get there, like, I'm not going to stand in the way of you getting the home that your heart desires. And I think hopefully that's kind of the right order of operations, because putting 2 and trying to get it up to 3 is going to be unsuccessful, I think. Hopefully that helps, Beverly. Why didn't TAR include addendum regarding brokers fees? So, okay, so Diane asks a good question. So she says, why hasn't TAR included that in paragraph 22? So we have 2 different organizations that kind of that govern us. We have Texas Association of Realtors, right? And that's our industry organization, like of realtors, by realtors, for realtors. That's where all of these representation forms and forms that like are clarifying our commission are coming from, because that's our group. The other group that we are, that oversee us is the Texas Real Estate Commission. And that's a government entity that is a consumer protection organization. And the contract forms that we use for the most part are TREC forms, right? TREC has created these contracts that they think are pretty even, right? Like they're not biased and towards the seller or towards the buyer. It's just for consumers to use through a licensed realtor. So, and to be honest, Texas Association of Realtors, when this decision came down in the settlement, scurried to make these changes and get us forms that we could comply with the lawsuit and still get paid. Texas Association of Realtors, as the like government consumer protection entity, they are not really like worried about how we're getting paid necessarily. They're not our industry organization. They do update their forms, but the cadence of when they update their forms is very different. Like Trek usually updates their forms every 2 years, and they're talking about changes right now, and they announce the changes formally in November, and the changes usually become effective in February. That's their typical cadence, and they probably will make some changes to the form. For example, making, addendum regarding broker's fees a box that you can check, but they may not if that's not a Trek form. So we don't know what they're gonna do. And I think that they've been floating changes, and I kind of went on their website the other day to like look and research, and I didn't find anything super fruitful. So that's kind of where we are right now, is that, Texas Association of Realtors, hustled to get these form changes out, and obviously they needed some clarification, which is why we already have our, updated versions of the forms. Trek, on the other hand, is kind of in no rush. It's just the government like doing its thing on its normal cadence to protect the consumer. Hopefully that answers that question. What else you guys got?
They did post late last week the vote for approved changes, so what they want to do is out there now. We've kind of got an idea of what it could look like.
Yeah, I didn't see anything
And then
dramatic
these
in
forms
there.
won't even be necessary anymore. So.
Yeah. Okay, other questions? So here's the deal. We're now well past an hour. Again, if you need to go, go. If you want CE credit, name and license number needs to go in the chat. And if you can send the $10 to the Venmo, that would be amazing. But name and license number in the chat is the most important thing to get the CE credit. Who has other questions? Like, what else do we need?
Hey, Zareen, could you cover just what to put again for the floating commission if a seller will pay up to 3% for full price offer, but will, decrease that if it's below? Could you, so if it's up to 3%, what exactly are we filling out?
Yeah, I mean, that's tricky. And you're not the first agent. We had Melinda Arson had the same thing where the seller was like, well, I know I'll pay at least 2, but I might pay more, but I want to see the offer. So what we told Melinda in that case was to fill out, if they said that they know that they'd be willing to pay up to 2, to put 5 here and 2 here. Because then they're committing you to offer 2% in any offer. Now they don't have to sign any offer. So if they're not getting what they want, they never have to make a deal.
Right.
So but in your case, if the seller's like really wishy-washy, you may be better off just doing this and say, look, let's not put any number forward, and let's just tell people, you are willing to pay commissions depending on the offer.
Okay, so that's what you recommend if I have a guy that says I'll pay up to 3% depending on the offer, just leave that as 0?
I mean, I think that's the approach that I would take. That doesn't scare me so much. I don't have like 30 listings right now to test whether those listings get shown or not. I would hope that all agents understand this, and even if they say 0, they're calling the agent to have that discussion, and they understand that the seller might pay, and et cetera, et cetera.
Right.
That's not every agent is as professional and good and diligent and educated as you guys are. So that would be my approach, but you guys are gonna have, I don't know if other agents have an opinion there. I think, anything you put in here is binding you as Jeremy and Briggs Freeman to offer that amount. So, but the other approach, and maybe this is, I'm having an argument with myself now. You could put this amount, and just, if you get offers that aren't good, then you can, counter back to the buyer and say, look, the seller is offering a full 3% here, and at that offer price, it just does not net him near what he needs to net. So something needs to give. And then that buyer's agent can say, okay, well, we got to increase our offer so that it's better, and it's a number that Jeremy's client would pay 3%, or we have to go back and say, okay, fine, like, let's reduce the buyer's agent commission to 2 and see if that gets us where we need to go with the seller. Does that make sense? It's a philosophical discussion. Jeremy, you need to talk to your seller and explain to him like the nuances and really let him decide, right? We manage the process, they manage the decisions. Does that?
Agreed. I think we're only going to see this with maybe some shrewd business people, and it's a high price range. I mean, it's 6.5 million. So I can
Yeah.
see why he wants to pay, a floating commission if he gets full asking.
100, I mean, and that's why I said, Matt, in a million years, would never now say, I'm automatically offering that up front. He's like, I wanna see what the offers look like, not that we're selling our
Right.
house, but he would do that, and that's fine. There's gonna be, that percentage of the population that approaches it that way, and as long as they understand like what that might look like, that's their choice.
Okay, thank you.
Awesome, good question, sorry I didn't circle back to you, I meant to, and then I forgot. Anyone else have anything?
Hey, Serene, this is Patty. I came away just a tad confused about the intermediary and what we need in terms of paperwork for compensation. So what I meant by my question is, in an intermediary situation, let's just say it's between Jeremy and myself, and I bring the buyer. Jeremy has a conversation, and Jeremy, I'm not picking on you. He has a conversation with me and says, oh yeah, the seller is willing, in the listing agreement to pay 3%. And so I get to the point where, we're finalizing paperwork and all of that, and the seller really is offering 2%. How do I, in an intermediary situation, confirm everything up front? If you're saying that we don't need the document that
Gotcha.
is, the broker fee, a document.
Okay, well, that's a perfectly valid question, and it's much easier to understand, like with you saying it versus just typing it out. So yes, so what I would do there, and I get your point, we don't need like a piece of paper that's executed by all parties when it's an intermediary, but I understand wanting to have some peace of mind. So I would send an email to Jeremy and say, hey, Jeremy, I know we just visited on the phone, just confirming on, 4501 Hanover that your seller is paying 3% buyer agent commission. And he emails back, yep. And then you have a writing, and Jeremy would never do this, but if we get to the closing table and he was like, oh, what, it's 2, like we have a writing and we'll have to settle that among Briggs Freeman. But at the end of the day, we do have a listing agreement that would say whatever was said, which we would collect from the seller, and then we would sort it out. But I think you're right. I think it's not a bad idea to just get a writing that, hey, when we talked about this, when I first showed this Briggs Freeman listing, it was this amount, I'm just documenting it here. It's a good, smart suggestion.
But wouldn't it be more prudent to have it on, a truck document?
I mean, technically intermediary, it's one broker. And so the seller doesn't care. They've signed the listing agreement with Jeremy as the listing broker, and they've said, I'm paying 6%. Sure. I mean, I think an email would suffice in that situation. If you want to go ahead and get something signed, you're welcome to do that. I will say, I'm looking for this document now. In the addendum regarding brokers fees, it's gonna say, no, that's not right. You're not gonna have an addendum regarding brokers. Yeah, there's nothing that the seller is gonna see that shows what Jeremy told you he would pay you. So if it would make you feel better to sign something between you and Jeremy, you can. There's nothing that the clients need to see. Does that help? Kind of, not really. I know that's not the answer that you want. We don't have a document that Texas is, I think Texas.
I think
Realtors-
my rub is everything needs to be transparent in writing for all parties. And
Well, so the listing, it is transparent in the listing agreement, right? What the seller is gonna pay and who it's gonna go to. That it is very transparent for the seller.
only to the listing agent and the seller, not to the buyer and the buyer's agent. And I think it's more clear when you're working outside of the brokerage than when you're working inside of and I trust everybody in the brokerage, but it's just a little more clear. That's all. That was just
No,
my-
I get it. Yeah, because it's clear to the seller what they would be paying. But I hear your point for sure. And it may be a situation where if it's your listing and it's 6% and someone walks into the open house and you personally don't want to represent them, but you want to pass them to Maureen, you're like, hey, Maureen, I'm going to take 4 and you're going to take 2. And that's between the 2 of you, but you need to document that. Does that make sense? Yeah.
100%.
Getting it in writing is never a bad idea. It's just a question of how formal does the writing need to be if it's like inter brokerage? Good question. Okay. What else we got, guys? How do we feel about this in general? I would love to like just have more discussion about what you guys are seeing in general. We don't have to do that now after we've been on Zoom for a million hours, but let's keep showing up for these things and keep showing up to your office meetings. Your managers are like so smart about this stuff. And you guys are too, and you can have good conversations about what you're seeing and how to handle different conversations.
Hey, Zareen.
Yeah.
I've got a question for the group or a thought. So last weekend, I was showing, a good friend, like 14 houses. And I did not go out and call every single one of those agents to verify what they're offering commission wise, with my thought being, once they figure out which one, if any, are the ones they're really interested, then I would go and have those conversations. Is that how everybody else is handling it, or does anybody else have any ideas on that? I just didn't want to sit there and make, 14, 15 phone calls to say, hey, what are you offering? Before I showed it to them. I don't know.
That's
If
how
that
I
makes sense.
understand it, Alex.
Yeah, Matt, you had a really good discussion about this the other day. You want to share what you shared the other day? It was really helpful.
Is this me?
Yes.
So just a couple of things. Like, one, I'm with Alex. Like, I think it's crazy to try to tax 14, like I was showing 5 or 6 properties the other day, but a best practice that I picked up that I really liked was that, like 3 of the 6 that I was showing, and these were all over $1 million homes. The agent, as soon as the showing was approved, the agent texted me and said, thank you so much for showing this property on Saturday. Just so you know, we are offering 3% BAC. If you have any questions, please call me, etc. So I knew just from that, they made it pretty easy, and it just made me feel good. Also, I thought, well, these are great agents. I hope that we find one of these that they like, because it was so nice. And then Alex, to your point, as my clients kind of got down to there's a couple that they're into, then I started doing the deeper dive on what are they offering, and is there anything, the discussion.
Okay, what else we got?
Hey, I had one more thing that was interesting. Like, I've also had on a couple of our listings, I've had other agents from outside of our brokerage, that we're all familiar with, texting me out of the blue, like, are you offering buyer's agent's commission on this property? Like, they're obviously like kind of polling like certain areas to, like, if you have a home, if you're listing in the French Streets of Holland Park, like, and they have a home in the French Streets of Holland Park, they're like going around asking like what everybody's offering, which is fine. I mean, it's not a big deal if it's out there. But I think that's another way that people are working with their sellers, is they're trying to find out what their competition's doing so that they can be competitive. Last point, Zareen. I did a class a few weeks ago with a title company, and it was interesting. And ultimately, I think when you look at all of these in one session like this, it starts to get overwhelming. But the reality is, it's like we're all going to go in. For the most part, we know what we charge as listing agents, and we know what we charge as buyer's agents, meaning each one of us sets our rate, and Briggs has what they would like for us to do. And obviously that's not set, it's always negotiable, but we all kind of know what we work for. And at the end of the day, you're going to be communicating like to your sellers, here's the cleanest, best way to sell your home. And a lot of this, we're getting into all these scenarios that I'm sure we're going to come across sometimes, just like we come across weird stuff today. But I think at the end of the day, the more we kind of come up with a routine and a system and just a simple explanation and go through these docs, I think it is easier. So I mean, at the end of the day, you're really only using some of this. They're not all going to be these crazy, wild scenarios that we've come up with.
Yeah.
so far that's been my experience. Like I've signed 2 listing agreements since we started using these. And my conversation is very similar to my old conversation because I always said the commission was negotiable. And I just try to get people on, we want the simplest, easiest way for a buyer to be able to come in and their agent to get paid and, et cetera. And most of my sellers have been all about that.
I love it. I love it. What else you guys got? Maria, can keep it simple. Okay. Well, I think this is it. I'm gonna send a follow-up email. One piece that we didn't touch on, and I will include it in my follow-up email, is what we are realizing is that the conversations that you guys are having with buyers, it can no longer be like, let's meet at the first house and hit the ground running, right? Like you need to have an actual conversation with buyers, hopefully do like a buyer consultation, because you got to get that buyer's rep signed before you show them houses. So hopefully you can make it a larger part of your process. And I'm sure some of you guys are already doing this, but we have really great collateral that the marketing department has created about like the value of a realtor, the benefits of buyer and seller representation. And then, actual formal listing presentation, buyer's guides. You may end up wanting to use like the benefits of buyer compensation in part of your listing paperwork, right? To help sellers understand, like, why do we want to pay these people? So I'm gonna include all the links to those things. They're beautiful, they're awesome, and best of all, they're ready to go. But that'll be something that I include in the follow-up. And if you guys have questions, just let me know. It'll take me a while to like edit the video and cut out the part where I shared my email and other things that didn't make sense. And so we'll go from there. Any other questions? All right, that's all we got. Thanks, guys. Yes, I'll share the slides, Alex. That'll be in the follow-up email.